You are listening to the System Impacted Podcast powered by STEM Ops. STEM Ops, which stands for STEM Opportunities in Prison Settings, is an alliance of higher education partner organizations committed to ensuring that STEM preparation during and post-incarceration is commonplace and successful. More specifically, STEM Ops' mission is to ensure all persons impacted by the carceral system are able and encouraged to pursue a culturally responsible and equitable, high-quality STEM education and career. STEM Ops is funded by the National Science Foundation as a part of their Includes initiative, which aims to expand access to STEM careers by underrepresented groups. You can learn more about STEM Ops by visiting the website stem-ops.org. That's STEM-OPS.org. In this episode, scholars Christopher Etienne and Boris Franklin discuss access to educational opportunities for students in low-income and more affluent communities. They use personal narratives coupled with research to explore inequities in K-12 education and discuss current impacts and potential strategies that could be implemented to create more equitable systems.
I'm Boris Franklin. I'm a formerly incarcerated individual, lead organizer with Jersey City Together, member of the IAF, visiting fellow for the Global Center for Advanced Studies, actor, author, playwright. I'm going to stop there. Because when I start to think about an introduction, I'm like, that's way too much stuff to list. I'm just excited to be having a conversation with you today, so we'll just do that.
Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christopher Etienne. I am also a justice impacted scholar, and I currently work with the Prison Teaching Initiative out of Princeton University. So what we do is first we write curriculum, collaborate with instructors and postdoc fellows to write curriculum for people who are currently incarcerated. We teach classes on the inside as well. And we also have an internship program where we bring in formerly incarcerated individuals and give them an opportunity to engage in high-level research at Princeton University through our summer program. And yeah, like you, Boris, I'm a playwright, author, researcher, all of that as well. Mm-hmm. But yeah, like it's truly like just a pleasure to have you here with us, and I'm just like always in awe of like all of the work that you do, and just like your continuous accomplishments like moving forward. So yeah, like I look forward to this conversation. It's long overdue. yeah. So we're going to get it started. So first off, during this podcast, what we want to do is kind of highlight the education experience of justice-impacted people. In order to just kind of put that into perspective, I want to start off with a question that highlights that, hey, justice-impacted people who are currently incarcerated, is not a monolith. That means there's a large, diverse group of people who went through like different experiences and different trajectories when it comes to academics or when it comes to employment. And so one of the things that we've discussed in the past is this idea of first chance at education versus second chance at education. And I want to start off by asking, what does a first chance at education versus a second chance at education look like to you, and which category do you feel that you fall into?
I fall into the, not completely, but into the first chance, if you're referring to by the time I go to a decent school. My original academic experience started in Piscataway, New Jersey. Even though my family came from this very poor space, we moved into a community, that had a great school system, and we were just on that border. So I was able to experience that starting out, and I went to a school called Randolphville, but I was only there to the second grade. However, By the time my father became a heroin addict and we moved back to New Brunswick, in this poverty-stricken space, I got a chance to see a different education. So I started with a quality education, and by that I mean the curriculum was aggressive enough for me to be able to compete, right? So when I get to New Brunswick, this is back when they taught script, so I'm going a ways back, but those kids were tracing letters, and I was already writing cursive. They were doing maybe 1 + 1, 2 + 2 sort of thing, and I was already multiplying and dividing. So I was getting an education where the curriculum was much more aggressive. It wasn't into the depths of an education. I was getting those prerequisites at a much faster space. So it put me ahead of those students. Because I was ahead of the curve, a lot of those students knew that I was getting a better education, or I came from a place with a better education. So what that wound up doing was it got the attention of a lot of bullies. So I would say, and so by the time I go through my elementary academic career, they rated me above average, which was unfair. It was just I was ahead of the curve. I was ahead of the game, right? And that that lasted maybe till about high school. When I got to high school, we moved to Somerset, in the poor part of Somerset, but we were just in that space where you could still get the benefit of a good school, right? So I went to Franklin High School, which was a good school. And I had been rocked to sleep by such a poor curriculum that now I'm thrown back into a space that has an aggressive curriculum, and it's difficult for me to catch up. By the time I caught back up to those students in the suburbs, they were way ahead of me. They had me by like a football field, So that's why I would say I fall into both spaces. I've had a unique experience that allowed me to see what folks have read about. I lived it. So I've had an education that would have been a very primary good education, and then I've had the benefit of a bad one. So I sit right in the middle of that.
And just to kind of put it into perspective for the audience, like kind of define what you believe a first chance at education versus a second chance at education mean.
Yeah, so a first chance at education would be an education that prepares you for the world that you'll be living in, right? So you go through these institutions, which would be your school. It should prepare you for life. And education is something that should prepare you for life. If you have an education that doesn't prepare you for life, that education is sort of subpar, right? So if you get out of high school, what do you think your chances are if you've had a bad education? Because now you got to go out into the world and compete. If there's a job application, you might be taking 500-600 applications, and you have to compete. And on that application, you don't have anything to put on there like your GPA, or you've had some advanced classes. And I'm talking about coming right out of high school. And even if you're competing for spaces in college, if you didn't have a quality education, they know that when you come in, your GPA is going to be low. They know that a lot of things that you're going to be doing in college, you would come in, and I needed to do like remedial math. When I got to college, they were saying to students, you should have gotten that in high school. They're already moving ahead. The whole No Child Left Behind is not exactly what it says on its face. You get left behind because your cohort is moving on. They're like, well, you can take a remedial class, or you can go get a tutor or do whatever you got to go, but the instructor's going on with the lesson plan. Coming from a great school, to challenge you to create a different vocabulary, right? And the way in which you learn math or English, importance is placed upon it because they understand that what you'll have to do when you get out into the world, so you're being prepared. I can represent myself in an interview a lot better than most people, and that's gonna give me an advantage, right? Because I might have had great English classes, and if you're pumping things like ebonics into another community, that's not gonna serve them in the real world. You kind of know it.
Yeah.
So that's like a subpar education because you're not being set up to succeed.
No, I definitely agree. When I think of first chance at education versus second chance at education, it goes hand in hand with what you were stating as well. What I would add to it is, when it comes to a first chance at education, all of the services you need to excel as a student is provided to you, you know?
Yes.
And so there wasn't a need for you to disengage from education because you felt that was a safe space for you.
Mm-hmm.
Like when it comes to second chances at education, you're talking about individuals who completely disengaged with education.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like they're no longer interested in school.
Mm-hmm.
They're no longer looking to participate in school. They're becoming anti-intellectuals. They're now against education as a whole. The reason that this occurs in students, because I think that naturally human beings are inquisitive. Like I think naturally human beings want to learn. Like this is how children learn to speak, you know, like they learn to speak by mimicking individuals, by watching the environment around them, by understanding social cues, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like we have like this inherent like want or need to like actually expand our knowledge, right?
Mm-hmm.
When we're not provided a safe space to do that, like when we're met with things like punitive disciplinary practices from our teachers, when we're threatened, when we're verbally abused, when we feel uncared for even, you know, because you're talking about in the average public schools in America, like teachers are absent like 30% of the school year. So like the lowest performing schools are often blowing their budgets on substitute teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them now are even bringing in like lunch ladies and custodians to teach the classes because they're so hard pressed to find teachers.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not taking nothing away from them. I'm just saying that I think it takes a certain skill set for you to be able to teach a class.
Yeah.
And part of teaching is engaging and building relationships with students. And if you're missing that in its entirety,
Yeah.
how can I have an education?
Yeah.
You don't know how I learn. You don't know what sets me off. You don't know if I have a learning difference, you know, that sets me apart from the other students in the class. And so if that is not there, then education didn't exist in the first place.
Yeah, yeah. And when I think of the thing that you said, wanting to learn and being basically innate, because even at that child level, you understand that learning is directly connected to your ability to be able to survive.
Mm-hmm.
If you do not learn, then you won't be able to survive. Any species knows that whatever it is, how do you get your food or whatever, you have to watch whatever's senior, and then you learn these things, and then you survive, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that in these spaces, when you don't have those supports, that you can't survive because you can't get a proper education. But a lot of what I looked at, because of my experience, was always the curriculum, right? That's why I was interested in the fact that you guys were doing curriculum, you know. And I read a Jean Anion piece. She was a professor at Rutgers, and she did something on that.
And I do want to kind of put into context because somebody's going to come and ask these questions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so like before you delve into this curriculum, you know, like we want you to kind of identify what quality education means to you. And from there, you know, we want you to kind of transition into like this idea of different curriculums for different communities. So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, that's why it's sometimes good. I should have looked at the questions, right? Because it does provide a narrative.
Go ahead.
A quality education would have those essential components to it, right? Those
which is essential.
Math coaches, you know, reading coaches, things that were going to make sure that you could really go through the process of, you know, receiving information and giving information. Like a quality education for someone who had come from another country, they would need some sort of bilingual classes. You know, the quality of the education would be tailored towards the population, right? So if I came into a space and then I knew that this was a poverty-stricken environment, or this was a environment that had whatever challenges it was, you know, there would be a team that would be thinking about that population and how do we best educate this population. Okay, so we have the Greenville section in Jersey City. To provide babysitters for that population who are not that affluent, and a lot of them are trying to earn for their daily bread, they created a space that says, okay, you can a lounge for parents. because that population would need something of that sort. And then also having PTA meetings on a Saturday, because a lot of people can't get there after work because they're, hustling, bustling on their way home from work, opposed to when I might be working with teachers in the Heights. And I'm using Jersey City, which they call the Tale of Two Cities. What those two different populations need is uniquely different. So the quality of education would be tailored to, like in my community, which is suffering from addiction and gang-related situations. I think that should be into the curriculum because that's what they're dealing with in this community, right? And I remember when I was going to school, they did have this big push against drugs because that community was suffering from it. So those things that we call wraparound services and that, right, will turn the quality of the education. And then as far as the academics, the quality of education, I would be looking for a curriculum that would be as aggressive and could compete with the curriculums of other communities, right? Because if you would say education was the key, for me, the curriculum is that key. So if you give two different populations two different keys, which doors can I access with this key, right? And if you have an education with a weak curriculum that can't compete with other curriculums, then the doors that you're able to open are probably going to be very, very limited. So, that's a pretty long answer for me to try to figure out the texture of an education when I'm trying to explain the quality of something, but the quality of it and the texture of it should be consistent with the individual who you are going to put this education on, so to speak, right? And because it would be tailor-made for them.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. So when it comes to like quality education, I see quality education as an education that allows the community itself to participate in these pedagogical practices that's being taught in these educational institutions. And so I've seen it. I've seen it happen. I went and did this observation on this phenomenal school called Rumson Fairhaven. And it's stationed in Monmouth County, New Jersey. And that school itself, in every football game, you would see people 70, 80 years old, and they're wearing their school jackets, like in PTA meetings. It looks like a club night. And when it comes to who they're bringing in as far as, principals and teachers, this is something that the community itself have a voice in, right? And so this right here is, even though it's a very privileged community, but this is the ideal of what education systems should look like, right? Because every community has its own unique challenges. And ensuring that the people who are teaching the youth in that community understands these challenges that community may be experiencing, like that right there will play an essential role, right, in quality education, also inclusive education as well. And so when it comes to quality, I see that. I see parents sitting at tables, ensuring that this curriculum is as competitive as the curriculum for the top schools in the nation. I see parents sitting down and discussing what diversity looks like. Are we ensuring that Black voices and Black authors are being presented to our students? Ensuring that history is taught right. We had to make sure that we cover these things as well, because we know that the average curriculum may overlook some of these essential milestones in history that we should all be considerate of in order to just be better people in life. And of course, ensuring that the students have the tools to compete in life as well as the tools to compete in college. We know that when it comes to some math classes, let's say pre-calc, right? Yeah. Pre-calc, in my school, we stopped around algebra. It might have been a pre-calc class they only presented to a select few members of a population, but I stopped around algebra 2 maybe, No, like, and it wasn't spoken of again. There wasn't a school meeting where like all the students were presented with these other math options. Like that was not part of the conversation.
Yeah.
But as I continued to research education, I realized that the majority of universities state that a student should know pre-calc if they want to compete successfully in these spaces.
Yeah.
Right? And there's actual data stating that students who don't know pre-calc are 40% more likely to like drop out of college.
Yeah.
Right? And so if we know this, why aren't these classes being offered in every single high school? It should be. Because like this is how you prepare your students to be able to compete in a college environment.
That would be the goal if that was the mission of the school. But that's why I said the different curriculums for those different communities are interested in turning out a particular result. This is why you might go to a school system that says 90% of our people who graduate from the school go to college. And then you might have a different statistic where it might say 30% of the people who graduate go to college, right? And then we can go into those percentages of who actually makes it through the process of college or drops out within the first 2 years. And of course, there are other factors, but there's some things that are very, very consistent. And one thing that I think is very consistent is those different curriculums in those different communities. And, like I said, that I had lived in different communities, so I'd already had firsthand knowledge of it. Then I read a piece by Jean Anion, who was, I think she was at Rutgers, professor at Rutgers. Well, in the event, it was on 5 different curriculums. And now, what I could argue now is that, education has flattened out a lot more than having 5 curriculums. It might be about 3 now. But and what she argued was which curriculum you got would determine which rung of the social and economic ladder you would occupy. So most folks were getting an education that was consistent with people who would do manual labor, right? So you want to socially reproduce that. So in that community, they don't put an education that would allow you to move above that space. And one example is that it was a lot of rote behavior. And I always thought this was ridiculous when I went to school. There was all these multiple choice tests, in which I could probably get a 50 without even reading the book. I was good for 50 without even looking at the material, because a lot of the answers were just they were just ridiculous. It was like it couldn't possibly be this. And so what I'm saying is, if I was to say I'm Boris Franklin, I'm a community organizer, and I was born in 1972, and that's then the question is, what is Boris Franklin? What is he doing? When was he born? Say, A, Boris Franklin, I work in a pie factory. I was born in 1972. B, I'm Boris Franklin, and I'm an astronaut. I was born in 1972. And then it's like Boris Franklin is a community organizer and born in 1972. C. If you pick C, your prefrontal cortex does not need to be involved for you to pick C. That is all memory. So you're getting rote behavior, right? So if you have a pretty good memory, I think that you're probably getting the education of a short order cook. You don't have if I said, well, that's Boris Franklin's community organizer and born in 1972, and why is that important? The front of your head might start to heat up, because now you have to think, right? So those are 2 unique things that I noticed in these educations, was that how much multiple choice was going on, opposed to how much having to give a real answer that you had to think about. So the brain was being challenged in 2 different ways. The hippocampus is lighting up for one student, and the prefrontal cortex is lighting up for the other student. This student is learning. The student is learning to remember. Yeah. And being conditioned in a different way. And those curriculums would go, and they would get more and more aggressive up to, people who were in an elite class. Their children were getting much more, you could look up the document to read a little bit more, but it exposed a lot about those curriculums and in these different communities and how they socially reproduce what we keep seeing.
Yeah, and that reminds me of just like this other education approach. What does it mean to sit down and critically think over the answers that you provided to a specific question? And how do instructors engage you, like when it comes to critically thinking about the answers you provided? And I noticed that because
they can engage you, and I want you to jump right back in. But if I wrote out my answer, you would have to write some stuff. You can't just put it in a machine and it tells you got 18 out of such and such. You might get a half point for this one, which means the instructor or your teacher calls you up to the desk. You come to the side of the desk, and it's like they talk about this answer because it's a different part of it.
And I definitely agree. Because in some of these spaces, because I also was fortunate enough to go to like a decent school, and then I went to like a terrible one right after that. And I remember just doing math. And the decent school I went to, which was actually Cape Coral High in Florida, when I got an answer wrong, the instructor sat me down, right? There wasn't like a red X going over the answer saying like, or a big zero or anything like that. The instructor was like, you were right until this point. The instructor didn't even use the word wrong. They were like, you were right until this point. Let's work around this issue that kind of threw you off track. And I would sit down and look at this mistake I made, and we would discuss how I made this mistake, so I don't make this mistake in the future, so I don't repeat it, right? When I went to school in Asbury Park, we were just given workbooks at times, and after we answered the questions, we would turn these workbooks in or whatever, and like you would just get a red X, and that'd be it.
Yeah.
There wasn't a follow-up discussion. It wasn't a sit-down conversation. And even when it came to like grades themselves, we had conversations in the more prominent school I attended. Like we would sit down and go over our grades. My instructor would say, all right, you got a C. What can we do to turn this C into an A? These are the conversations we're having. This is where you are currently in class. How can we make you better? What can we do to improve these grades, right? Versus the school in Jersey, in Asbury, I was failing every single one of my classes. I didn't get a call home. No one asked me to come into the principal office. And something had to be amiss because, like, the year before, I was all A's and B's. Now I'm failing everything. Like, if you're in a school system that cares, right, and you see your student go from being an A-B student to failing every class, you're sitting down and figuring out what's going on. It might be a problem in the household. It might be a personal issue. It may be a mental health breakdown. Who knows?
Yeah.
Like,
we can't divorce the school. That's because you can't divorce the school from the community. You know, you put it, because when I went to the next school, as soon as I walked in there, the one thing I never saw was a fist fight. There was fist fighting on the porch of the school, on the front steps of the schools. As soon as you walked up, they were like just going off all over the place. Bang, bang, bang. Guys just fighting. And then most of the teachers were in there. They were dealing with a lot of disciplinary issues because they were in this challenging environment. And there's a lot to be argued about how the curriculum plays into everything. It's like, it's easy to look at it in just a one singular way. You know, you got to look at more than the school. We'll just say that for now.
Yeah.
You got to look at more than the school.
Definitely.
And they send that curriculum to that environment, and it socially reproduces that environment. It's part of a process.
Yeah, it's part of a larger issue. We're going to move on to the next question. Personally, how have you seen the school system change since you attended public schools? Or have you seen any change in the school system since you attended public schools?
The school system changed in the respect that the demographic of people changed who occupy that community. I grew up in New Brunswick, and it was we had a sizable Latino community, but now it's mostly Latino community. So, that has changed. But in terms of the education, if you could move beyond the technology, it's basically the same. And people from my community always think I'm tough on the school system, but I work, being a community organizer, I work inside of some schools, and I have a very close relationship with a lot of superintendents. So I'm in the action, around these schools, and some of them have computers where they didn't, and some of them might have a media room when they didn't. So they have a few more resources, a few more trinkets. But when I'm talking about education should teach you to live. It's still subpar. I mean, it's like slapping some paint on something and calling it rehabbing an apartment, because we're turning out the same data. So it's not much different. I mean, or the data would be different. There's nothing else to suggest besides the fact that they have shiny new computers, or whether or not you get a new building that says that the education or the quality of education is improving. The quality of the schools are changing. The quality of the institutions are changing. Like when we had the Infrastructure Reduction Act comes in, and $89 million might go to the schools, and then they get new bathrooms, and they get a new water fountain, and they get a kiosk in the auditorium, and then they take a picture, and it's like, the education is improving. I'm like, the building's improving. Mm-hmm. But I'm not so sure the education's improving because I'm still seeing the same statistics. Mm-hmm. So, even if you get it, it's just, so the quality of education is not changing. And then, having, top teachers who want to teach in that community, they want to go somewhere safe. That's why I said there's a larger issues at play. So the short answer is that I don't see it changing much. It just looks better.
No, yeah, and I definitely agree. But I think that when it comes to education itself, in schools we started adopting the idea of participation trophies. Mm-hmm. You remember where it's like, hey, even though you didn't win the game, here's a trophy, but you didn't earn it, right? Yeah. So I see a lot of schools doing this now, where they're giving diplomas away as a participation trophy, right? So you're just handing these students diplomas. So you could write that we have an 80 or 90% graduation rate, right? Like, this is what you're looking to do. But then I hail from a community where that statistic is true. We have like 80%, 90% of our students who are graduating from high school. A couple years back, the parents went into an uproar because their kids couldn't complete the written exam for their driver's license. Mm-hmm. You're talking about kids who graduated from high school who can't complete a written exam to get their driver's license. That's an issue. Mm-hmm. Like, that is a human rights violation. It's not just you're not going to be able to navigate through society if you don't have those bare minimum literacy skills or literacy competency. Mm-hmm. And you see schools that are just comfortable with these numbers. Yeah. And they're not worried about equipping students with the skills that they need to navigate through their life.
And that's why I would say it flattened out. Because at first you would have only heard those stories from a poor community, below the poverty line. Now you'll hear that same argument from a middle-class community. See, at one time, that's why I figured that now, with that Gene Anion piece having 5 curriculums, I believe it's maybe closer to 3 now. Mm-hmm. But there are other, we just had that big scandal with those celebrities that were trying to get their children into certain schools because they understood the value of it. Mm-hmm. So when you talk about the quality of an education, they understood the value of getting into that school and their kid getting that education opposed to getting this one. Mm-hmm. They know that if you put these two students neck and neck in a race for a job, your child is going to smoke them if they had this education, or they have an unearned advantage. If they don't win, then they just didn't win. But you know they have an unearned advantage, right? Because they had a better education. It's not equal playing field. So you need a job. You need to earn for your daily bread. You want a certain quality of life. When you see a person that's really, really well off, I'm talking about really well off, you don't think about that guy must have really went to a good school. You figure he must have cheated. He must be got a wealthy dad if he goes buying a Maybach or something. Or you don't think this person went to a good school. That's a whole another education on how that person can get from where they're at. So I'm following the line. So if you wanted a certain quality of life, your education should be the thing that gets you there. So if you get in these weak educations and then you keep turning out, people below the poverty line, that education is just not gonna be up to par. So when I'm looking at the education in my communities, I'm like, you're still socially reproducing the same people, economically and socially. It's the same thing. So it can't be better. It can't be different. It looks better. I went to the high school. I saw the high school. They have all the new technologies. But you keep producing individuals who will consistently live below the poverty line.
Yeah,
and education should be upward mobility, right?
Yeah, like and we want to crank out, people who are in like the working class period and who won't be able to rise beyond that. And I have nothing but respect for like all of the service workers, but I'm pretty sure when we send our kids to school, we're looking for them to like follow this dream of a heightened professional level. We want to ensure that they have the pathway to complete it. But we're currently in an educational system where in some spaces that's not even discussed. Like I remember sitting down with students at Rutgers who were talking about, my father had told me about Rutgers. Like I was gonna either apply for here or UPenn. We've been having this conversation since I was in elementary school. Yeah. I'm like, wow, that's phenomenal. Yeah. And you have students who were reared in schools that also did that. These conversations was taking place both at home and in the school halls where like students were being given these options towards a prominent education for their future.
And that education will provide them what?
Capital. It'll provide them success.
Some sort of a quality of life.
Yeah.
So the education that you might be getting might not be worth $2.
Yeah. And the thing about it is that in some of these inner city spaces, that college conversation isn't even happening. Like I sat down, like with my members of my old community, and I was like, didn't back in the day, like these high schools had like college tours and you would have speakers and deans from different colleges come up and speak about their campus. It was like, they don't have that over here.
That's called a program. Right? When they have an urban program that comes out and they give it some fancy name or some fancy acronym, then it's like, okay, that community gets the benefit of it for that administration. And then it's gone. Just like work programs that would come into that community, and then it would produce some sort of a bottleneck where a few individuals make it out, and you can take a picture with them and say, the system works for everybody. This is proof. Like folks look at me and they'll say, well, and they might charge other people in my community and say, well, why can't you make it because Boris did? You're not applying yourself. I'm not a good representation of what goes on in my community. I had a huge amount of help because a program came through. Without the benefit of that.
For some reason, these programs look like a permanent part of the infrastructure in certain schools. Why is it permanent here but completely missing when it comes to lower class communities?
There's a disinvestment in the community as an overall whole. And then usually when these programs come in, they're not sustainable because there's always money problems, right? But those problems bleed into larger problems with how local government runs. I mean, in each community, you get two budgets. You get a school budget and you get a municipal budget, right? And then your state aid comes in based on maybe, let's say, this municipal budget and the taxes that you could collect. If you have a mayor that's not willing to collect the taxes But the state aid starts to decrease because they're saying, well, you guys can make more money over there. Look at all the taxes you can collect. And the state aid starts to decrease. The school board, nobody wants to raise their taxes. So now you have to rely on some philanthropy. Mm-hmm. And then they'll do these programs for a period of time, like the NJ STEP that we got the benefit of. I think it was Bill Gates' daughter had given $5 million or something. So there was some sort of philanthropy. But once the money runs out, what happens? Mm. So now you have folks who are coming through and they got hit at the cutoff. So the few people that made it out are the people that you're lifting up, and you're saying that, you know, America is a dream where you can have upward mobility if you just
apply yourself.
You know, really, really apply yourself. That's not true. If you peel back the onion and you start to really look at things, and you know, so you can't sustain those programs in those communities because it's a money component applied to it, and the money don't always make it to our communities because local government. I mean, we'll go down a rabbit hole if we go in that direction. Yeah. But you understand that's why it's not sustainable. So this is why I don't. You know, when I'm going to certain meetings and we're arguing as if these other things don't exist. So I'm at, you know, a school board meeting. If it was just strictly on the school board, then that would be a solvable problem. Mm-hmm. But education is a big problem, but it's part of a larger problem.
Yeah, a larger social issue. Like, for instance, when I was speaking about schools in more prominent neighborhoods, sometimes the instructors I met, they spoke about the value of their alum network. Mm-hmm. They're like, yeah, we receive like a small budget, you know, from like the state or whatever, but the people who are really supporting this, such and such down the street, it was the one who bought the new gymnasium. Such and such around the corner, it was the one who funded the new STEM lab because of the privilege, you know, of the social status and the bank accounts of the individuals in that community. You know, you start seeing more money being poured into these schools. Old money. Old money, like being poured into these schools to like ensure that the education these students receive is something that's going to make them CEOs and bosses in different companies.
See, I come from generations of poverty. I'm not the first generation to struggle. And then we know people who have generation of wealth. That's why I said if life was just this vehicle, a bad education would be consistent with being the flat tire. There's a problem with the whole car, but first of all, the tires are flat. So even if we did fix the engine, it's not going anywhere. Because so education is a very important problem and a bigger problem that's systemic. I'll leave that there.
We'll dive into this next question, and I could start off. I'll take the lead. But basically, culturally, is there a correlation between schools and incarceration? This question kind of helped me understand why my upbringing in school was how it was. You're talking about me coming through school doors as a teenager, as a youth. A first person I see is a security guard, a security officer who has cuffs on him. And it's normal, it's common practice for this guy to cuff students. And it's common practice for like the cops to be called to the school and students being escorted out by police officers. I see this practice like very much throughout a lot of neighborhoods and in inner city communities. You may run into a cop on your way prior to getting into school, and you may have to like empty out your backpack and show what you have in your backpack just in case, you know? Like you may come into school one day and they may have the canine units like just walking around the hallway sniffing at lockers, right? You know, you got metal detectors. You have surveillance taking place. And you have threats of arrest also, you know, something that's very common practice in the schools. So I was taught how to be an inmate before I ever set foot in a jail. I understood the procedure behind a locker search. Before I ever felt cuffs, like wrapped around my wrist, I knew what a pat down was. I knew how to assume the proper position for a pat down as a teenager. You know, like I understood, you know, if the metal detector beeps, you take off your belt, you take out the change, and you take out your key, and then you go and you circle back. I understood that.
Right.
You know, so like part of my education in public schools was how to navigate through prison.
Yeah.
And I used to wonder why at times I encountered people in prison who were just like it was like comfortable for them.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm like,
aesthetically, there's no real difference.
yeah, it's not. And it seems like you're being conditioned, you know, to be we're preparing you for prison. And I'm pretty sure that some of these common practices we see in inner city schools, they're nowhere to be seen in schools in affluent communities.
Hold on to that little bit of a thought. But I will say this, that aesthetically it's really no different in some schools. And I don't know if it was intentionally or unintentionally, but it's also true. You know, I remember going to JFK school in Prince Street Projects of Newark. And by the time I got to East Jersey State Prison, it looked completely the same. This was a shock to me because I didn't come from an environment that was dealing with poverty at that level. So the behavioral byproducts weren't there in my community. They were there, but not to that degree. So folks that really came from those challenging communities, their schools, because there's levels to this. I mean, their schools really looked like a prison. And so I knew that aesthetically that there was this issue. But one thing that I would say is that we know that by a certain age, we lose interest in school. There's that disinterest. And I would argue somewhere around the 5th grade for me. You know, at one time, I was excited about school, and you see kids going off to school with their little backpacks. Doesn't matter where the system is. Doesn't matter if they're going to a crappy school or a good school. They're excited because this school's going to engage their mind and their learning, right? They're still getting that cerebral expansion. They're having their aha moments. So school is a fun place, at least for that, right? And even if you have the social challenge, but then when you hit like the 5th grade, it seems like school's just not fun anymore, right? And you don't develop much after that for a lot of folks. And I had a theory, which is that when you talk about arrest, before you put the handcuffs on, if you arrest the development, then it's easy to arrest the body. That's why I've always focused in on some of these curriculums and social learnings and all these things, because if you arrest the development, and I will go on to prove this theory, but it's something I held in my mind for a very long time, that if you arrest the developments, you'll essentially arrest the bodies. You know, you don't give a person, an individual, an opportunity to grow. If you can't grow, then you can't solve conflict at the next level. And in our exercises that we're given in school, you always have to solve some sort of conflict. Your math problem is a conflict. So you're solving things, right? But if the education is weak, then you don't get good at solving problems. You don't get good at making proper judgment. You don't get good at so many other things. You know, when education is taken out of the society. Imagine society without education. I mean, you can leave in church and take education out, right? That's a very, very dangerous place. But what folks also realize is that how hard it is to govern educated people.
Definitely.
You can't control them the way you want to.
And that's why it goes back to your different curriculums, because you're talking about in spaces where students are taught to question, right? Taught to question, like, hey, if you feel that your answer is right, sit down. The student and the teacher can have a debate, a back and forth over this question, over this essay, over this assignment. They're taught to question authority. They're taught to critique decision-making. And then in other spaces, a student could be reprimanded for asking a question to a teacher. A student could be escorted out of class for being critical towards an aspect of the curriculum.
Yeah. It's socially reproducing two different citizens. That's why when you say education, if we just take it and put it in the schools, then it will die at the curriculum level. And they'll be like, okay, everybody has a different curriculum. But you have to understand, these schools are building citizens. And these two educations are building two different citizens. One population to control another population. And you just consistently socially reproduce it. We're going to be looking at it in the 20s, you're going to be in the 80s, it doesn't matter. So, even when you look back at that question, how would schools change? All you got to do is look at the population. Look at the citizens. Nothing is changed. Black and brown wealth is still about $4,000, and the average wealth for the white counterparts is like $350,000. That's not new. Those are current data. That's not Mississippi in 1920. That's New Jersey in 2023. In Morris County, you're 22 times more likely to go to prison, right? If you're an African American. That's right now. This is current data. So you can take a lot of pictures, do a few photo ops, buy a new book. It's the same. We're socially reproducing the same thing, and we're starting at that education level, because in the beginning, the first education or first environment you're born into is your house, right? And then as that child comes out of that house and into the community, we go into the school. The day the kid gets to go to school, and the kid can't wait to go to school because they know this is supposed to be a place of learning. This is the place that's going to make me competent, where I can get big in the world. And me getting big in the world reduces my anxiety about surviving in the world. Right? And then you take me to a place and it doesn't make me big in the world. It arrests my development. When the kid first goes to school, they're hungry for it, right? At that early age, you can learn 2 languages without an instructor. Just speak them both in the house. You don't need an instructor. The brain is hungry for it. Even kids with challenges will learn 3 languages if you're just talking in the home, right? Our Latin community, they speak both Spanish and English, because they be like, my mom spoke Spanish to me at home and the teacher spoke English to me at school. I know them both. Didn't have to go to class for it. That brain is primed for this. And then you put a cap on it. And then the child becomes disinterested in school. He's just arrested by development. This place is oppressive in some respects. School days become gray. I'm learning more in the community at 12. It's exciting. I'm exploring. I'm being challenged. I'm succeeding and I'm failing. And I'm learning. I learned how to hustle, how to go to New York. I'm exploring. I'm growing in the world. I might not be growing in the way in which might make me a certain citizen in the world, but the thing, I'm not set up for that. I'll leave that there.
Thank you for joining us for episode 6 of our System Impacted podcast series. During this session, we took a deep dive into disparities in K-12 educational models and explored its impact on local communities. Although strides have been made, systemic issues continue to create a glaring rift between the haves and have-nots, and it's up to us to critique these systems and re-envision ways to allocate needed resources to directly impacted communities.